Don't remind
You're
me.
bringing up that? Oh man,
I
rough.
don't want to talk about it.
I mean, the strength, right? The strength and diversity, you know? That's nothing to laugh about. Any comments, any thoughts, Mofu?
Well, if you run a card as a one of that is really strong and core to your deck, and you want more copies, then that's kind of like just wearing one sock instead of two. But if it is a card that is kind of situational, something that you only need to cover one thing, then it's kind of like only wearing one hat, you know? You don't need more than one of it. It covers what it needs to cover. That is the story of Necroelementist and Lyriel, I think. Well, the way I actually like to break it down, and this is something I actually like to talk to Exo about too, is the decision arc between running 1, 2, and 3 copies of a card in your deck kind of usually for me comes down to if it's not core to my strategy, if I don't need to see it every game, but it's an option I'd like to maybe be able to develop, or I have something that searches for the card that could kind of help me get it more often, I'll just run one copy. If it's a card I generally want to see every game, but I don't really want it in my opening hand, I'll run 2. And if it's core to my deck, or I want it in my opening hand every game, I'll run 3. But how do you feel about that, Exo?
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on one of the best uses of an analogy that I've heard in a long time. Okay, so big ups to you on that. Secondly, I feel like there's multiple ways to look at one-ofs in a deck. So the very straightforward way is what you were talking about. It's like, if I want to see this many cards in my deck, or if I want to only see it once, or if I want to see it twice, I want to see it in the late game, I want to see it in my opening hand, that can determine how many cards you play in a deck, like, say, Death's Breath at 2, or, you know, Soul Squasher at 2, something like that. Now, another way to look at it is its cost. So if you know how many cost or singular cost cards that you want in your deck, such as I want 13 2-drops in my deck so that I can have a consistent 2-drop on every single turn too, or I want X number of 3-drops, X number of 4-drops, that kind of thing. As long as you keep it in line with your curve, you can sub one of those cards out on the curve if you feel like it's a good tech choice in the matchups you'll be playing against. Because they do similar things, such as like a Lyriel to a Soul Squasher, they're both 2 play point, essentially 2/2s or 2/1s, you know, just they can be aggressive or they can just be something that you put to the board. However, Lyriel gives you a different benefit than Soul Squasher does, so subbing out 1 2-drop for another 2-drop for additional options during the game can be very effective. So when you see a lot of 1-drops in a deck, look at the curve also. Look at where along the curve they exist and see how many drops they have along that curve, and it'll make a lot more sense to you as to why it makes sense in that particular list.
Yeah, and in addition to that, you did mention JaZe probably has a huge fan of people that he tests against. I think sometimes seeing little things like a sub out 1 copy for 1 copy of something else, these are decisions that I think really come to mind when you've played a list over and over and over, and you start to feel like, and I think a lot of people are feeling this about Little Soul Squasher now, maybe 3 copies is too much, but I still need this card every game. So he takes 1 out and tries to find some kind of room for something that's similar, that can kind of get a similar job done of just being a 2/2 on 2, and just kind of helps in the way that Soul Squasher might have been kind of suffocating him out of resources before, or not been doing well enough on turn 2. And that's where we see things like Lyriel come in. She can kind of give you that option, a little bit of a more sturdy 2-drop, while also removing something later in a bit more of a kind of different situation for the low reach of her effect. But things like that I think is usually what will mostly justify these otherwise strange at a glance kind of deck building decisions.
Right. And honestly, that comes to just at the heart of, you know, like you said, how many times have you tested particular matchups? You know how many cards, certain copies you want. But again, a lot of one-of tech cards are literally just that. They're a one-of tech card. For instance, not every single Burn Rune player has done it, but we've seen a lot lately that Twin Guardians makes an appearance in these Burn Rune decks as a one-of, as a very specific tech card, to beat, say, Forest, or to beat, say, some other deck that's trying to tempo you so that you can play a threat, protect it, and build up a big board on a singular turn. So
yeah,
there's a lot of
even
different ways to think about it.
Right. Even today we're seeing in JaZe's Burn Rune list, there's a one-of copy of Taboos and a one-of copy of Mutagenic Bolt. So to kind of even bring that into line of what you mentioned about card costs, it's like, what does he want to do on turn 6 is a good way to think about it. And his answer is, most of the time I want to play Master Mage Levi, I run 3 copies of it. But I need a little bit more. I need more options around turn 6, and so he runs not 2 copies of Bolt, not 2 copies of Taboo, but just 1 of each. Because who knows which one he's going to need at a time. If he puts both in the deck, then he has access to both of them, maybe not super consistently, but that consistency isn't something he's looking for, it's just the options.
Right. And that's something that I feel like as you progress in a game, especially someone to the extent of JaZe who's played a ton of matches at a high level, once you get to that arena, it's about the options, because your deck can do a singular thing, but if it's a very straight line, your opponent can pick apart that line and then fight against it. But if you have all of these multiple options at your disposal, it's really hard to set up boards against you that kind of mitigates. So for instance, if you're playing against a mutagenic bolt, maybe you don't fill up an entire board, right? You just play one really big threat and you pass, so mutagenic bolt's not that big of a deal. But JaZe is like, aha, but I have Professor of Taboos, which is great in that situation. So it kind of helps you on both ends of the spectrum and makes it really hard to play against.
Right. The only thing that makes me sad is between all these 3 cards, I've been thinking nonstop about how the game will change in rotations. Is the card that I miss the most is the only one of these 6-cost cards leaving being Calamitous Curse. But
yes.
That said, I actually think JaZe is starting to fall behind this game. Even though he has an Oz and it is starting to build up, I think getting these sigils out of his hand and drawing a really, really strong series of cards in his next top like 3 or 4 is probably going to be essential to him kind of getting back into the game. V2 has healing options coming up and hasn't really been pressured out of too much life at the moment.
I hope today makes me eat my words and Seraph is just like the best deck to be bringing today. It just wins all of its games. I really hope that happens. Because it is looking really good here. Again, like you said, Oz is a great option for JaZe to push into the end game, but cards like Radiance Angel and Themis' Decree, he has all of these nice little options to kind of extend to the late game. He even has Temple Defender to play out post-Evo turns so that it can kind of block a big attack. Very hard to get through, things like that. So I think V2 is in a really great spot. And of course, as I said before, these timings with the Amulets, Beast Call coming out on 5, so it pops on 8 when Seraph can be played. Just really, really good play from these Seraph players today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would have looked at that turn and asked why he didn't just develop the Radiance Angel. You have heal, but that's where we see it. Underwear did the exact same thing. These are players who aren't just bringing Seraph as a sort of impulsive decision, but they know exactly these little tricks that kind of help make sure that they optimize every single turn and do these non-obvious plays that kind of help as much as possible.
Right. Let's see. So JaZe has built up another 6 damage in hand, which is good, but that Radiance Angel is going to kind of pick that apart. And there is an Evo to deal with this Oz. But, of course, the Oz won't lose any value. He used the Mutagenic Bolt when he could, so...
Kind of puts V2 in a spot where he has to get rid of the 4/5 body to, I think, eliminate any chance of risking any held spells. That was just a single spell, which was the remainder of his play points, which can sometimes make it a little bit ambiguous. But I still think the Radiance Angel is a really strong play here. Just so as to kind of... I will always kind of refer to it this way. It discards the history of there ever having been a Crimson Sorcery, effectively. It's like, healing 3 health is kind of the same thing as you never had it in the first place, and you just evolved a fighter against me, kind of thing.
Right, exactly. One of the things I actually want to talk about Oz too is kind of what you brought up in the threat factor of that Oz. You almost always have to kill Oz the turn it's played, even if it didn't draw your opponent any spells, just because of the threat of those spells being kept in hand, like, maybe Demonic Strikes or Piercing Runes or Dance of Deaths or whatever the Burn Rune player might be playing in their deck. If you don't take the opportunity to kill the Oz, and then they do in fact have those extra 1-cost spells, you're at a huge disadvantage at that point.
And it's interesting how that develops more and more as a factor of time. Like, it is because JaZe had used all of his play points that threat was that much more present. If it's like an Oz that comes out and they only play a couple of spells and then they spend the rest of their play points on like an empty Levi or just using a sigil, then that's a much bigger sign that maybe those were all the spells that they had. Sometimes that can be used for mind games, but often it's not too safe to just develop it.
Right. So what do you think about this turn? Do you think developing more damage in the case of things like Mage of Nightfall and Halo Golem? Do you think playing a little bit more defensive with the Professor of Taboos, especially with V2 being out of Evo options, it kind of forces something like a Themis' Decree out?
That's interesting. I was about to actually say that I thought Halo Golem Nightfall was the play, but I can see why he's not going for it. Taboos doesn't get you that much value in this matchup because he's not a very pertinent threat to Seraph. That's because I think where Taboos shines as a card is how he can board flip against opponents who are trying to win by simply having the board, or by developing massive threats like a Bahamut that just suddenly vanishes into a bullseye. But the reason why I was about to take back the idea of Halo Golem Nightfall is because of what we just saw. Playing around Themis, he doesn't want this Nightfall's damage to be wasted. It is his only chance to really develop the Evo point for damage other than just developing Levi, which might be a better option for him coming up. But this Nightfall, I think, is going to be very important to get across phase here.
Well, what it does do, if he does develop the Mage of the Nightfall this turn, this is going into turn 8. So that is a big enough threat, especially with an Evo orb up left, that I feel like V2 can't play the Seraph here, and I think that's what JaZe was planning for. I want to force him to Themis' Decree and possibly run out of Themis' Decrees on my Professor of Taboos, play this threat here, and even if he does have a Themis, it means that I get one extra turn that Seraph doesn't hit the board.
Really strong timing for it, actually. I didn't even consider it, even though that's probably the most important consideration to make in the matchup. I just haven't seen Seraph in so long, but yeah, very well played. Forces out of Themis, as we call it there. I think that actually puts V2 in a pretty tough spot. He's not super healthy. JaZe has a lot of top decks like Oz or the like that could just continue to whittle this down or just suddenly flip it back up against him. A lot could happen here, but, you know, until he finds something like that, JaZe actually does have a pretty slow hand.
Yep, and it looks like he is going to develop an Evo here. It's probably the best use of an Evo. A Levi, of course, adding 3 damage as opposed to 2 on a follower, and of course follower damage not guaranteed anymore, especially against a control deck like this Seraph deck.
Now, when V2 actually gets to play this Seraph is, I think, the biggest consideration here for like how this matchup is going to end up. Now, this is a kind of sarcastic lethal setup in assuming the Levi manages to survive anything. I was about to say that, but there actually isn't removal for the Levi effect.
There isn't. There isn't. That Dance of Death was a very pertinent play there because, of course, the Princess Snow White could have jammed in with the Star Torrent to finish off the Levi, but if there's no removal spell for this, we already have lethal in hand here.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a lot of cards in V2's hand and was like, oh yeah, well, it's just a 4-3. He's going to have an answer for it, but right, the Priest of the Cudgels, all the Evo points already used to try to set up the Seraph turn, and it's not working out for him. A Hollow Dogma could do it there, but that's about it.
Ooh, there we go. Okay.
Now this is interesting. Tribunal into perhaps just developing a Priest of the Cudgel. You could try to put a area on the board, but right, the Priest of the Cudgel is more active, immediate removal, as V2 recognizes that he doesn't have, you know, immediate board impact from hand anymore.
Ooh, and I feel like that Magic Illusionist might be one of the best cards that JaZe could have drawn in this situation. Obviously, it doesn't immediately kill his opponent, but it does allow him card draw and a threat that can't be removed at the moment, because without Evo points, without a Blackened Scripture, there's no way to actually get rid of this. Unless he wants to expend double Star Torrent after he attacks it with the Priest of the Cudgel, which means that Seraph is much more unlikely as a win condition.
That's right. That puts V2 in a very peculiar decision arc here. I think this is the turn to develop the Seraph. He knows, like, he has perfect information of JaZe now. He knows the card in hand is a Crimson Sorcery. There's 2 damage on board that he can't remove, and he has 2 health above it. Sure, drawing 2 damage is extremely likely, but there isn't a particular other line of play that plays around it perfectly, I think. The double Star Torrent is an unrealistic way to try to extend his time here.
Right. And V2, of course, making that play. That makes the most sense. You have time to develop the Seraph here. You got to do it. You got to take the risk. If you don't, you're just playing not to lose and not to win. Ooh.
That's so unfortunate.
And of course, like a master, JaZe top decks the damage he needs in multiple different ways.
The name's Levi. Don't forget.
You know,
Easy life, JaZe. He's like, I know this matchup. Easy. Now just had an agreement.
Of JaZe, like next 2 cards, Halo Golem and Master Mage Levi. You know, forget Seraph. That's all you need. It wasn't even close in the slightest bit.
That's all you need. So I actually want to take a deeper look at JaZe's shadow list one more time here, just so we can have it open to see what his tools are every turn for stopping or actually aggressing through Haven and Forest here. I think V2's in a lot of trouble. The Seraph deck might be able to get through, but the Forest deck against Shadow, again, a little iffy.
There's a lot of here or there about it, if you ask me.
Yep.
Just because I think
I
there are
like that.
some... Yeah, there's some tech cards that I think in Shadow we've seen lately, especially yesterday. In Necro Assassin in particular, I remember this from Akamaru Red's deck. I didn't feel like Necro Assassin was performing excellently against any particular matchup. I think it was a little bit redundant with the amount of sacrifice that Shadow already has for Lurching Corpse. Yes, Necro Assassin can effectively board clear with Lurching Corpse sometimes against faster mid-range or aggro decks. We don't see a lot of those. So often, I remember it was just kind of dead in hand. It didn't have a solid target, it wasted value with Lurching Corpse to just kill one thing. He runs 3 of it. Akamaru Red, I think, only had 2. In addition, Necro Elementalist works with some very, very specific situations, but it's not going to help him versus Seraph. So maybe this will help him out against Roach, but again, even if he has an answer to Wood of Brambles, it's not aggro forest. It's not V2's main plan to win. So I think while Mid Shadow is a strong deck versus these two lists, these techs might not be what's right to deal with all of this, and that is the one weakness that I can kind of spot about what might fight JaZe here.
Just look at V2's hand right now. 2 Blackened Scriptures, a Priest of the Cudgel, like all the tools he needs to fight the Shadow early game. It's got to feel good. When you have double Blackened Scripture, Priest of the Cudgel against Shadow in the early game, like you're feeling like you're rolling hot here.
Yeah, it is just like the comfiest opener against Shadow.
He already has his Seraph. He has a Radiance Angel on curve right after the Priest of the Cudgel, or actually a turn after probably, because you play 5 and then 6, so probably playing a little misuse of his play points, but I don't think he's going to mind that too much.
I think curving out is probably a lot less important for decks like Seraph, but JaZe did get a pretty juicy Andrew Alphys off there. He hits a lot of pretty important targets, even though Priest of the Cudgel is going to deny him one. That is a good solid amount of card draw that JaZe can use to stay in the game for a little while longer.
Now, an interesting choice I want to point out just to talk about the countdown of the amulets again. I think V2 actually had a harder choice than would be first apparent with looking at the Priest of the Cudgel. He could have played the Tribunal that turn again to set it up so that it pops the same turn as Seraph, and he chose not to do it here in favor of playing the Priest. So while that looks good now, it might hurt him come a few turns from now, and maybe might be that he can't play that Seraph on 8 again.
Right. Well, if it is of anything that's particularly strong for V2, he does get the first turn 8. So JaZe is going to develop one of his 7 drops in 7. I believe that's where this hand is going, unless something drastically different happens for him. And then V2 has that turn to have enough defense to last through whatever JaZe's follow-up is. And after that point, he has 3 pops? Is it 3 that it requires to pop Seraph completely?
It does. It requires 3. And he does have those at the moment. Yep.
He already has what we could call Roach combo in hand here, or lethal, if he can just get to that Seraph. So it is merely just a matter of waiting out 2 more turns, or at least having enough defense by that point that there's no lethal for JaZe. And what we're going to notice, I think, is something that we had discussed earlier about how Haven interacts with Shadowcraft. If JaZe has a single burst win condition, he does run 1 copy of Tyrant. But he just got his first Shadow of the game.
Right. Not very likely that that thing's going to be popping for 13 plus this game. The one thing I am worried about for V2 here, though, he has a very strong early game against Shadow. However, he does not have any Themis' Decrees to back up killing things like Thane and Ektar boards. He does have Star Torrent to help. But now Zombie Party even, if he does play down a threat like Radiance Angel, it's just going to fill up the board. And without any Themis' Decrees, these are just going to start pressing lethal with these Ektars in hand.
Right. And, his hand is going nowhere right now, and on top of all of this, he pulls a Priest of the Cudgel, but I think he's going to have to evolve this turn, perhaps. If he wants to get rid of the Ceres, which is the most active threat at the moment. Let's see. I think the question now is no longer a matter of whether he can clear the board effectively by the time he plays Seraph. He just needs to have enough life to play the Seraph, and then just take an uppercut from JaZe's board, and then survive it into his own lethal combo.
So let's count this. I'm assuming Thane is the play here. I can't imagine any other play makes sense. And then we'll see what his evolve goes to. Once that is, we'll count out the damage. If it's not lethal, then Seraph might just have another victory.
Yeah, Zombie Party I don't think is going to be it. It doesn't threaten enough damage. Immortal Thane adds 1 damage to the Bone Chimera going face this turn without needing to evolve it, so 2 puts him at 18, and his remainder board is 2 skeletons, 2 white, Thane, Evo point 1 plus 3, 4, plus 8, 8, plus the 4 from Thane, plus the 2 damage. And that would board lock him, actually, if he went for this play, so he wouldn't have the Eekter on the turn after that to increase the amount of damage that would be threatened by that board.
Yeah. So numbers. It really just comes down to where that Evo point goes and how he chooses to fill this board up. Because like you said, if you board lock yourself, all V2 has to play is Seraph, and if there's not lethal on board, the game's just over. Of course, Soul Conversion can get around that, but again, if you count the damage, it might still not be lethal because V2 has managed to stay at 20.
Right. I think what JaZe's got to consider, very, very important here. The obvious play to make aggressively is Thane trade, but you can't trade that Bone Chimera. You lock yourself, you become so weak to other things. I was about to say maybe you Thane and evolve to get rid of the other thing, but he goes for the Bone Chimera and the Zombie Party. Now, while I wrote out this play, how much damage is actually threatened here? 5 plus 12?
17 exactly. 17 exactly.
Ooh. But I was looking down the wrong tunnel exactly. I think that this is the absolute perfect play to have made.
Yep, this is the line. Forget Thane, produce lethal with Ektar. Force. This is exactly, we've talked about it in the past. This is why I think Seraph is a wild card, because if you really know how to play against it, all you need to do is present things like this, like lethal the following turn, and it's a trap V2 just fell into. Apparently just didn't want to play that game, but of course giving up lethal to the Ektar. JaZe playing these matchups perfectly, taking this victory. Another quick 2-0.
All right, JaZe takes the win 2-0 off the back of Zombie Party into Demon Lord Ektar. And you really have to be thinking about those lines of play, right? If he had done Tribunal on that turn 5, I think he would have taken an extra 2 damage, but that still would have technically let that Tribunal pop on the zombie.